Well, good afternoon. Everybody say good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you. You know, the Italians have a saying, beware of the man of one book. Think about that for a minute. Beware of the man of one book. Clearly at West Valley College, we are committed to programs like this, to helping you avoid this fate. Good afternoon. My name is Phil Hartley. I'm president of West Valley College, and it's my pleasure this morning to sort of kick the program off and welcome you all to this very wonderful program. This is the West Valley College Writers on Writing series. This very dynamic and innovative series provides an exciting opportunities for members of our college community to meet and learn from leading authors. And this series is sponsored by the Department of English at West Valley College, our college library, and is supported by the Associated Student Body. On behalf of our community here at West Valley College, I would like to express my great respect and appreciation for the faculty and staff who have organized and directed this outstanding activity, and to the guest authors who have agreed to share their personal insights with us into their creative works. The philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer described books as the paper memory of mankind, and today's panel of authors will certainly share an important part of our California memories with us today. It's now my great pleasure to introduce the Professor of English, Doug Temkin, who will introduce our program today. Doug?
Greetings, I welcome you here. I'm Doug Temkin from the English department, and I'd like to welcome you to the WOW series and just remind you that this is an ongoing series, so if you're here next fall, you can look for more writers programs. There's also a series that the English department and library co-sponsor called the Spoken World series, which is storytelling. So you can look for those two series if you find this interesting, which I'm sure you will. Before we start, just say a few words. A lot of people to thank here, including President Hartley, the Student Senate, which provides the funding for this program, Scott Ludwig, and the crew at the KSAR 15, the Saratoga's public access TV station. Margie Moran, who did the great posters, and if you want to have posters as a souvenir after the program and you see one on campus, just take it down, it'll save me work. And let's see, the English department, especially the instructors who cajoled and otherwise intimidated and persuaded their students to come to the event today. And again, the West Valley Library, which co-sponsors this event with the English department. So I'm going to introduce Malcom Margolin here on my right, who's the publisher of Heyday books, which is the publication or that publishes all these writers, plus many, many more writers. You might want to look at their website. It's Heyday Books, Heyday, and look at it on site, online. And I'll let him introduce the speakers today. So, Malcom, and I'll bring you the mic.
Yeah, thanks. I thought maybe since I was the only one that didn't have a mic, they were trying to tell me something. First of all, I want to thank the college that we're publishers. We do a lot of California material. I don't know too many other places that have a series like this where they invite the best writers into the midst, and this is fairly unique. Do you know other places like this? No. I mean, this is just a wonderful program, and I was aware of when we began receiving material and invitations, what it takes to get 4 people from different parts of the Bay Area together and into the same place and get an audience, that a tremendous amount of work goes into it. And I'm really grateful for it, and everybody ought to be grateful for it. It's a wonderful and unique thing. I was asked to moderate, to introduce, and then each of the panelists will have about 10 minutes to talk or read or gesticulate or whatever they're going to be doing. And then there are some prepared questions that I'll ask and open it up for other people's questions. And the order of the speaker, I'll introduce people in the order of the speakers, and since this program is so thorough, you've got such wonderful biographical information, it's made my job easier. Over on the far right is my old buddy Gerald Haslam. Jerry grew up in Oildale, which was, when he grew up, I guess it was an unincorporated part of Bakersfield. It's kind of had the reputation of a blue-collar, redneck world that he grew up in. His one grandparent was Mexican, and the rest were, I guess, what we call Okie, that it was a rough place to grow up. And Jerry has gone on from there to write incredible numbers of books, and he's really prolific. And he's prolific not only in books. He and his wife Jan over there have 5 kids, and every time I talk to him, he is going off to another grandchild's birthday or performance. I don't know how many grandchildren these guys have, but I think you couldn't do better by populating the world with little Gerald Haslams. I think that's just probably one of the best things you could ever do. So that's part of Jerry's great gift to us. He has written many books, including a couple that we published. One of them is Haslam's Valley, which is a collection of his writing. And another one was Working Man Blues, the history of country western music in the Central Valley in Bakersfield, the Buck Owens, Merle Haggard world. Next to him and in the middle is Rose Castillo Guilbault, and we published her book last year, hardcover edition of Farm Worker's Daughter. We've blessedly run out of copies, and we have a paperback that we should be getting in another couple of weeks. Rose grew up was born in Sonora, Mexico, and came to the U.S. as a youngster. She ended up settling in the Salinas Valley with her parents and was indeed a farm worker's daughter. She went on to have a career and working for the Chronicle, working for KGO. She now directs, I believe, public relations and outreach for AAA. She's had an amazingly varied life of high accomplishment and public service, and she came with us, with this book came a wonderful manuscript and the most astonishing Rolodex of friends. I've never seen anybody that had so many people wishing her well, and I think when she speaks you'll see why. And off to my right is Francisco Jimenez. And Francisco was also born in Mexico, came to the US at about the age of 4. And he'll probably want to talk about writing, but I've been thinking about Francisco a whole lot in recent months. He came in as an illegal immigrant at the age of 4. The family snuck through a fence over the border. And he wrote a wonderful book, The Circuit, that describes his upbringing, I believe between the Central Valley and Santa Maria on the coast, and describes what it is to be brought up with the specter of illegal immigration, of naturalization and immigration hanging over your shoulder, of what it is to try to create a life in an environment like that. He's a professor of, I believe he went to Columbia, and he's a professor of modern language and literature at Santa Clara University. What we published of his has been in an anthology under the Fifth Sun, an anthology of Latino writing in California. It's a wonderful group of people, and I'll just say that before I shut up and let them talk, which is why you came, that they're remarkably similar in many ways, and it's not just the obvious ways. I think there are many ways of using writing, and a lot of people use writing to escape from themselves, to escape into other worlds. And these people have all used writing to explore the truth of their own life. They haven't used it to go away from their own life. They've used it to explore their own life. And they also have managed to combine, it's 2 professors and somebody, two males are professors, and Rose Guilbault has had a big life in media and public service. And they've managed to combine writing with another complex kind of life. And they've all been just culturally active, and there's a kindliness, there's a good-heartedness that pervades all of their work. It's a pleasure to have everybody here. And we'll start off, Jerry Haslam will have his 10 minutes, and then Rose, and then Francisco.
I was at my old junior college last Friday, Bakersfield JC, and it made me think of how important these institutions are. The bridge they provide. Many of the kids in my group in high school in Bakersfield couldn't think of going to university. It wasn't in their minds. But those who matriculated to community college, the junior college, suddenly were given a whole new lease on life because we came to understand something was possible that had not been possible for our parents. And at least some of us went ahead and pursued it hard. And as a result of that, we've been able to lead interesting lives, or I would put it. One of the things that happened, not at Bakersfield JC, but at San Francisco State, though, was a class in American literature where I had a term paper assigned. I was already, I should tell you, trying to become a writer. I was not in the creative writing program, but I was getting up every day and trying to write. And the world took very little note of that, I might add. But I suggested to a professor that I might write a term paper on William Saroyan, a Fresno writer. And to which I was told, the response was, well, that would be interesting, that'd be amusing, but why don't you write about a serious writer, an important writer? Well, he's lucky we weren't in Oildale, because I might have answered him a little differently. What I did was follow his instructions, but that really set me off looking at the area where I had been raised, looking at the Central Valley. What was it? Why did people disdain it? Why did they look down their nose and say, gee, boy, I'd sure hate to be from Bakersfield. Years later, when I was finally in a position where I could spend some time researching it, I did look at it and I realized all sorts of things that just, many of them are quite obvious. It is the richest agricultural region in the history of the world. The history of the world. It has the most diverse ethnic communities of any rural region in the world. It has terrible rates of poverty and a lot of discrimination, both class and racial. But it also has the capacity to bring people together from different cultures, different backgrounds. And so as a writer, I began to explore those things. And I realized it was an absolute treasure, that there would be no exhausting the material. What I didn't know was in basically the same generation, a whole series of others from the Valley were doing the same thing. And I think it was because we were the post-World War II generation, the first kids to go to school, go to high school, go to college after World War II. The sense of the possible was different. And so now you go back and you look at that area and you see Joan Didion and Richard Rodriguez from Sacramento, and Maxine Hong Kingston, Leonard Gardner from Stockton, Gary Soto, David St. John, Roberta Spear, just on and on from Fresno, Luis Valdez from Delano, Frank Bidart from Bakersfield, and on and on and on and on and on. Only two of those people, Bidart and Didion, are from the privileged classes. Every one of those other writers are from blue-collar families. Now that was something new in California writing, not just the Valley, but in California writing. There had been individuals like Jack London, of course, but to have that kind of a representation of people who were not from the highly educated, whose families were not from the highly educated or wealthy classes, was just something absolutely different. And what it told me was that something was fundamentally different in the makeup of the state. A part of it was, as I said, just the expectations that followed after World War II. So I set out to try to write about what I understood to be the truth from the perspective of someone with a life like mine, and had perhaps the world's largest collection of rejection slips. I actually had a friend, a novelist friend, Jerry Rosen, with whom I used to exchange notes on the back of rejection slips. Just our way of saying to hell with them. They can't fool us. We know that if we stay at it, we can do it. And because I was teaching full-time, I should also add here that I married somebody who did not insist on a big car and a new house. She understood that we were not going to make a lot of money, or at least not right away. And I kept working, and I wrote little short pieces while I was teaching full-time. I became a teacher to support my writing habit. I was never really interested in being a teacher. It just turned out I liked it, but that was not my interest. I wanted to be a writer. And this is for all of you who are thinking about this profession, I just didn't have enough talent to do it immediately. It took me years of hard work. I was 53 when I won my first major award, and I had been writing since high school. But unlike boxing or track and field, at 53 you can be better as a writer. And you just have to stay with it and want it badly enough and care enough about the material. The other great advantage, of course, that I had coming from that area was you could look into the cultures that characterize the Central Valley. You can look into the cultures that characterize your own family. The neighborhood that I lived in, for example, was all but 2 people on the block I lived on were from Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Missouri. My mother was a native Californian. There was another lady up the street. And these wonderful neighbors used to always kid my mother and call her a foreigner because she was a Californian in California. It was that unusual. Well, that struck me as being absolutely rich. Very few people get that sort of a perspective, have that opportunity. Moreover, if I learned to listen a lot and make notes based on what I heard people say or saw them do. And this is, I'm sure both Rose and Francisco will talk about this too, but when you work in the fields when you're young, you meet an amazing variety of people. And many of them are quite smart. They just haven't had much opportunity. One of the people I met, though, who's become famous, Merle Haggard and I were classmates in Oildale. But he was sort of a pain in the neck for everybody after his dad died. And one of our neighbors, Mr. Hillis, with whom I worked on the end of a hoe for one summer, said of Merle, "That kid's wild as an acre of snakes." And I thought to myself, I couldn't have made that up. It's too unique, it's too individual. So I tried to become, to quote Henry James, one of those upon whom nothing is lost. I tried to really pay attention to what was going on around me, to what people said, to what they did, and kept copious notes. I have file cabinets full of notes. And for a while, they were just that. They were notes. But eventually, I was able to begin incorporating some of them into the work I was doing. So the first thing I would say to you who are interested in writing is become one of those upon whom nothing is lost. Pay attention to what's going on around you. Write down how people wear their clothes. Write down how they talk. I was in a bar in Albuquerque with a couple fellers, and there was it was a lunch time, and we were having sandwiches and beers. And from the bar, we heard this very high-pitched voice say, "Carpe diem." And you don't hear that in a lot of bars in Albuquerque. So I was with Don Graham and Tom Pilkey. I looked at Graham, and he looked at Tom, and then another voice said, "Carpe diem. What's that mean?" Dead silence. "Fish of the day." Well, yeah, I'm not clever enough to make that kind of thing up. So boy, that got into a story almost immediately. It didn't take any time at all. The other thing that I would suggest just in this opening remark to anybody who's interested in being a writer, aside from keep notes and make observations, because you can't make up anything crazier than what you're going to observe, as long as you look at it. And the other is get in the habit of writing, if you can, every single day. You don't have to spend 8 hours a day. You can give it an hour or even 30 minutes. If you can write one sentence that's really good a day, pretty soon you'll be writing 2. And soon you'll be writing a lot more than 2. Most of the writers I know, I know some exceptions, but most of the writers I know really are like snowballs. They really do begin to pick it up and pick it up and pick it up as their craft improves as a result, just of practice and getting feedback. And finally, the last thing that I'll say in these introductory remarks is that One of my teachers at Bakersfield Junior College, a woman named Dorothy Overley, said to me in just a regular literature course, not a creative writing course, she said to me, you really want to be a writer, don't you? And I said, yes. And she said, well, you can be. I thought, well, that's good. How? And she said, you have to work at it, and you have to remember to write about what you know. Don't worry about writing about Paris. Have you been there? Of course, I hadn't. I'd been all the way to Los Angeles by that time. I'd really done a lot of traveling. Don't worry about Rome. Don't worry about Berlin. Write about Bakersfield. Write about Oildale. Write about the block you live on. Write about the girls you date and the guys you fight. And then you might write something of merit, because those stories, if they're well enough told, are going to mean more than just the events of the story. They're going to say something about the coming together of cultures, for example. They're going to say something about poverty in the richest agricultural region in the world. And so Dorothy Overley has remained one of my icons, a wonderful teacher, and I'm just a lucky guy at Bakersfield Junior College.
I came to this country when I was 5 years old without knowing a bit of English, other than things that I had kind of heard on television from my cousins who had a television, because we didn't. And it was from American Western, so it was like, stick 'em up, and what's the matter with you, partner, things like that. And we came on a Greyhound bus to move to King City, California, in the middle of the Salinas Valley. And my mother had divorced my father in Mexico, but when she came, she met a man who had come to the United States as a bracero. And she married my stepfather, and we moved to the country, and that's where we did a lot of farm working. He was a farm worker. In the country, it was really far away from town. It was, miles and miles away, and we were very isolated. The only other family was the boss and his wife and his kids, who were very fair-weathered friends, and sometimes they'd play with me, and sometimes they didn't. And because they created social distinctions, eventually we didn't really, engage with them very much. But what I discovered very early on was a love of reading. And as the English language revealed itself and revealed the words and its secrets and the meanings, I just developed a fascination with reading. And I would think that because I lived way out in the country, it probably had something to do with my level of, being entertained to read books. So books became, in the cliched standard of a lot of writers, my friends. And television too, but at that time there was only three major networks. I know it's hard for you to believe in this age of multiple cable and networks and all that, but there was ABC, CBS, and NBC, and those are the only stations that you could watch. So what would happen, on Saturday afternoons after you watch cartoons and all that, there was really nothing left for you to watch. So therefore, the only thing to do was to read books, as I was growing up. And I think a major influence for me, too, was my mother. She was an amazing storyteller and came from a tradition of storytellers in my family. And so she would tell me stories, everything from the Revolution, from the Mexican Revolution, and how my grandmother, would hide, her brothers, and the stories of the Yaqui Indians of Sonora, and just tremendous, a wealth of wonderful stories. I felt as I was growing up, this was this was in the 60s, even though this session has been dubbed Writers in the 50s, I was a little bit younger than that. So I actually grew up in the 60s, and this seemed so far away from me. It was so far away from the Beatles, these stories, and from rock and roll, and from Vietnam, and from all that stuff, that it really caused, it just seemed like so far away, long ago and far away, which of course it was. And Mexico seemed long ago and far away, to me too, some of the stories that she told me. But she would share stories about everything. She read this magazine called Vanidades, which was somebody's nodding. Yeah, it's sort of like it's not a Cosmo. I don't know. It's a magazine that has to do with kind of good housekeeping, I suppose, for lack of a better comparison. And it was in Spanish. And there was these stories by a writer named Corín Tellado, who was the I don't know, who's that romance writer? Danielle Steele, I guess a Latina Danielle Steele. And she read these romance stories, and she'd tell me them, and then I'd read books, and I'd share the books that I read, even though it was the Five Little Peppers or whatever, but I'd still share them with her. So we had this story-telling tradition in our household, and that was very, very much part of the fabric of my life. And she was wonderful. She was she was able to be a mimic and do different voices, and it was really a wonderful storyteller. Now I could never do that. So I think that what happened with me is that I chose to write these stories, and I started writing at a very young age. Just fiction stories, whatever. And I felt that by the time I was about in 8th grade, when I was 14 years old, that was one thing I could do well. And this was, the writing was something that I always got good grades in and got awards and got recognition. So it was about the only thing I could do well. I wasn't very good in math. I wasn't very good in science. Just didn't have what I felt was I wasn't very academic. But I could write, and I loved this reading. My mother, and I had said to my mother at one time, I think, I would like to be a writer. And she shook her head and very sadly looked at me and said, "Ay, mijita, you can't make any money being a writer," which is true. So don't be a writer to make money. And not have a career. And at that time, to be a Mexican girl and to be raised in a farm working community, you didn't have the expectation for you was not to go to college, which was to take a small job at a bank, at the local clinic, which was if you were a high school graduate, that is, to just get away from the fields and from the packing sheds and all that. And that was a step up. And my mother's world didn't include writers or anything else. That's what she saw as a progression for me. So I had a teacher who suggested I talk to the local newspaper reporter, who was a woman at the Rustler Herald. That was the name of the newspaper. And I went over there to talk to her about writing, I guess, is what I thought. I didn't really know. And so she introduced to me the whole notion of that you could make a living writing, and it was called journalism. And that was a very practical sense, not as a creative writer, not like what Gerald was doing, and from a very early age knowing that that he could do this or wanted to do this, but more so, what for me was more important is how can I make a living, how can I make a life, and earn it, be paid for it. So there was this thing called journalism. So that was my route. That's what I became. I became, I was a journalism major, and I wrote for newspapers, and I had a career as a journalist and broadcast journalism for a long time. But what happened somewhere along the line is I developed this really intense desire to talk about those years in the Salinas Valley, what it meant to be a farm worker's daughter, what it meant to be Mexican growing up in this country, because I didn't see very many books that were written that way. And Richard Rodriguez was one of the first books, he published one of the first books that started talking about that. And that was very influential to me to write about that those stories had validity, that they were important, and that it was important to tell those stories. And if we didn't tell those stories, nobody else would. And I would read commentary, and I would read things in the newspapers, and they were written by others who were non-Mexican, non-Latino. And they always didn't get it right. It was always something that was sort of their interpretation of who we were and who our families were and what we thought about. And I just resented it. And I thought, they don't know. They don't understand. They've never lived it. I remember this one colleague of mine had said, I understand what it's like to work in the fields because I did it one summer. And I thought, no. So it was that kind of thing. What is it that you to give it a window into our culture? I became obsessive about it. So I started writing columns in the Chronicle from that perspective, from the Hispanic perspective. But I wanted to write something, bigger, something more broader. And what I did is I tried to write the same story, what became A Farm Worker's Daughter, in different genres. I started by trying to write it in fiction, I wrote it first person, third person, just sort of experimented with it a lot. And finally, the strongest voice that came through was first person, so this memoir genre. And then I was able to, to begin to tell that. But it was really critical for me, and I think in terms of the writing and wanting to write. It was interesting what Malcom said is that a lot of writers escape their own lives. They use writing to escape their own lives, and I think early on, that's exactly what I wanted to do. But as I got older, I had always used, journalism for social change, to give voice to community, to give voice to others, and that's why I had wanted to go into journalism in part also. But it's really nice what you said, Malcom, to use their lives to explore social issues, and that's really what I wanted to do, to open it up. And I think that still in society today, there's really not enough of a voice from this Mexican experience in the Southwest, in California. And by the way, my father's best friend was an Okie, so we had a lot of Okies in the Salinas Valley, and it's funny, you're one of the first writers who wrote about that, and it was that I read about that, and I was kind of fascinated when I... Castillo? So maybe somos parientes, Yeah. But I'm going to stop there because I'm going to pass it on to Francisco, who I think of, if I had a brother, I'm an only child, but if I had a brother, it would be Francisco, because we have such similar stories, and he's just a lovely person. That's my spiritual brother here.
Thank you, Rose, for that. I do have sisters, but if I had more sisters, let me start by thanking Doug Temkin for making it possible for us to be here. And I feel very honored to be in the same panel as Gerald Haslam, whose work I've known for many, many years. When I was in graduate school, as a matter of fact, I started doing research on Mexican-American literature, and one of the first pieces I ran into was one of his, which I used in my one of my papers. And then, and also Rose Castillo Guilbault, I have wonderful respect for her. I think she's one of the finest writers that I've known, and it's a privilege to be in the same panel with her. And Malcom also, the work that he does as a publisher and editor, it's invaluable in terms of having the public get a better understanding of what California is all about in terms of its ethnic diversity and richness. Everything I write is autobiographical or semi-autobiographical. Everything I write is based on my childhood experiences growing up in a family of Mexican migrant farm workers. And the inspiration for my writing comes from the community of my childhood, that is migrant workers. And the reason I write is to chronicle part of my family's history, but more importantly, to document the experiences of many, many families from the past and the present who work very hard from sunup to sundown for very low wages in order to feed their children and to make it possible for all of us to enjoy our meals every day. That is to say that every time we sit at the table to eat our fruits and vegetables and so forth, we hardly ever think about the people who made that possible. The other thing that is important to recognize is that the immigrant or the migrant experience has to be recognized for many reasons, and one of them is the economic contributions that migrant workers make to our country. As Jerry indicated, California is one of the most powerful states in the world, and it's the 6th or 7th most powerful economic entity in the world. And one of the biggest industries in California is agriculture. And who's responsible for agriculture? Farmers and farm workers. So farm workers then contribute tremendously to the economic development of our nation. And so for that reason, I feel that it's very important to write about that experience based on my own experience, with the goal of expressing the hard work that these individuals do and have done for many, many years, and whose lives, for the most part, are invisible. So the inspiration then for all my writing comes from that community. Doug Temkin asked me to talk about my writing, because this is a panel discussion on writers on writing. So I thought that I would do something to indicate to you what is the process I follow in my own writing. And to help you out, I call them the 7 R's, and I'll go through them very quickly. The first R, in terms of before I begin to write, is to do the research, because I wanted to chronicle part of my family's history, whose experiences were common to many families of yesterday and today. I researched my own family background. I interviewed my mother, who's a wonderful storyteller, my older brother, and other relatives. I looked through photographs, old photographs and family documents. For the chapter, for example, in Breaking Through, where I talk about being deported back to Mexico, through the Freedom of Information Act, I was able to get all the documentation from the time we were deported, which I utilized for that first chapter in Breaking Through. I also visited different places where we lived as I was growing up in the San Joaquin Valley. Selma, Fowler, 5 Points, we used to call them Cinco Puntas, Corcoran, Visalia, and by going to the different places, and some places, migrant places where we lived no longer existed, but just being able to see some of the little towns and some of the vineyards and so forth, that brought back memories to me. I also read through some of the histories of towns. One of them is, this is our valley, a history of Santa Maria. And Santa Maria is a setting for Breaking Through. And in reading this book, This is Our Valley, A History of Santa Maria, Santa Maria, as you know, is an agricultural town. Now it's famous because Michael Jackson was tried there. But in this 200-page book, only about 2 paragraphs were devoted to farm workers, and yet the foundation of this city is based on the work that farm workers do. So after I do all this research, then all this research helps me to go to the second stage, which is to recall. That is, the material I gather helps me to recall, to remember particular experiences. And these come to me in various forms. For example, the smell of grapes, the smell of strawberries, the dust, the leaves, also the sounds, especially Mexican music. I listen to corridos, Mexican ballads from the period that I was growing up. And so by listening to music, it would bring back memories. I used to see my father, for example, tear up when certain songs were played by Pedro Infante or Jorge Negrete. And so as I listened to this music, I could see my father's face and his tearing up. The next phase is to recover. So research, recall, recover. As I began to concentrate on those particular experiences, and details, trying to remember details. The effort in trying to remember those past experiences helped me to recover other experiences that I thought I had forgotten with the passage of time. I think this is a common experience when that one experience leads to another. So you recover, in many ways, things that you thought you had lost with the passage of time. And in my case, a lot of time went by. The fourth stage, or the fourth R, is reflect, which is the most important phase for me. That is, I then reflected on those memories and recollections from my childhood and looked at them from an adult point of view and made a series of discoveries about myself, about my family, my community, and I gained a deeper sense of purpose in terms of my writing and my teaching. As a servant, I would say, to my students, and some of them are here supporting me, and I appreciate that. So the next R, after reflection, is to recreate. That is, from those memories and reflections and discoveries, I recreated the 12 stories in the book titled The Circuit, Stories from the Life of a Migrant Child, in each of the chapters in Breaking Through. And then the sixth R is to rewrite. Writing doesn't come easy to me. I have to do many, many drafts for each piece that I write. And so it's a lot of rewriting that goes on before I feel comfortable with the piece. And the biggest challenge for me in writing The Circuit was to relate the stories from the child's point of view and make them accessible to both children and adults. And the biggest challenge in writing Breaking Through, the sequel, was to relate the stories from the adolescent point of view. Then the seventh R, I think I've covered 6, right? The seventh R is the reward. The reward. That is, that after you finish writing something and you read it to yourself and you say, this feels right. You know, I think this feels right. And the biggest reward for me is when I do public readings, or when people come to me, just as I walked in this earlier today, before the discussion, a woman came up to me from, I can't remember the country, but anyway, she said to me, you know, after reading your story, that is really my family story. We were also immigrants here. For me, those are the rewards, because it affirms the purpose for my writing. That is, that I write in order to document the experiences of many, many families. Not only Mexican families, but also other families whose parents or grandparents are immigrants. And so it seems to me that it's very, very important then to relate those stories, to tell our stories, because when we tell our stories, we begin to make connections. Even though we may be different culturally and linguistically, we have stories to tell, and as we tell those stories and we make connections, we see ourselves then reflected in the other, and we rejoice, at least I do, I take joy and comfort in making connections, the human connections, with other groups that are different from my own. So I'll stop there, and I'll be happy to participate in the discussion.
Thank you for all that, everybody, for such an emotional warmth and intelligence. Very beautiful. I'm kind of curious as I look out. Are people in this room engaged in literature as writers, or see themselves engaged in literature and writers? Could people raise hands or something? Some, yeah. And do you see yourself writing in print media rather than electronic media? Yeah, yeah, great. Books.
So you mean like handwriting?
No, no, not like handwriting. I mean, like the product of it goes into books rather than into scripts for screen or whatever. No, yeah, no, I was just kind of curious. There were a whole lot of, I have a few questions that I prepared and were prepared for me, which I'm going to deviate from. And people are certainly welcome to jump in with questions of their own, either for everybody or for particular people. And I think that would be really welcome. I was kind of curious as you were talking, for whom do you write? When you write, is there somebody that you have in mind that you're writing to? Is it an old teacher or a parent or a friend or your old self or a younger person? Is there some audience that you have in mind when you write?
I don't think I'm that systematic. I write what I find interesting, and I hope that I'm enough of an everyman that some readers will find it interesting as well. But I don't know that I've actually targeted an audience in quite that way.
Yeah, I don't think I write for anyone in particular. I do write what I think stories that people people should know about. What I think that might be instructive in the sense of getting to know more about my community, my family, that kind of thing, but not a particular person in mind.
I don't write for any particular audience. As I said earlier, my hope is that my work is accessible to both young people and old people, people of all ages, of all backgrounds. But I don't have any particular audience in mind when I write.
Could I ask an ancillary question? Do you write for native speakers of English or non-native speakers? Do you consider that your readers are going to be people who know mostly or say only English, or people who are new immigrants or even families of immigrants?
Are the acoustics good enough so that you can hear the question? Yeah, the question was, do you write for native speakers of English, or do you write for speakers of Spanish? Whom will you write?
No, I mean any other language.
Or-
like think of
Or any
immigrants
other
in
language,
general.
yeah.
Do you write for native speakers, or do you write for people who know several languages? Do you think of that?
Well, you look at me, I look like the one who would be least likely to use Spanish, but I use Spanish quite a lot in my work. And I assume, though, that it can create a context that makes it clear enough to non-native speakers of Spanish so they can understand what the words mean. In fact, I think that if you do it properly, you can actually intensify the meaning in a literary experience by carefully selecting what you use and don't use. Because after all, we're in the process of constant assimilation. Every language is constantly assimilating things from other languages. I think of the speakers as, I think of the readers as being English speakers, but English speakers with an open mind.
I would agree with that. I write, for English speakers, and I use also a lot of Spanish. But, as in other literature that I've read, whether, we use like a lot of Yiddish words or other foreign words. I mean, it doesn't matter. It makes it more interesting and richer, I think. I just, in my book, I provided some definitions in the back because my assumption is that you're not going to speak Spanish.
I write for English speakers, but I do include some Spanish in my work, and what I try to do is within the context of the word, most readers can figure out what the word means. Obviously, if you write in English, you're trying to reach an English-speaking audience, right?
Yes, but what you're writing about is frequently the immigrant experience, or say the experience of being an outsider or somebody who has something unique,
Yes.
and that's very similar to the immigrant experience.
That's correct.
And I teach immigrants, so that's why I
That's-
have that
yes.
question.
Well, I think what I write about is the immigrant experience, exactly. And most everyone, except for Native Americans and African Americans, are either immigrants themselves or descendants of immigrants. So we all have a lot in common, don't we?
So Francisco touched on it, but I'd love to poke at it a little bit. And Rose had mentioned that there's not much money in writing. There was a wonderful statement that Robert Graves made where there's no money in poetry, but then again there's no poetry in money, so it all works out. But okay, so if there's not money, I'd love to have people talk about the satisfactions of a writing life, and maybe divide it into two parts. The first part is the satisfaction of writing itself, not what happens to it after you've written a book, but the satisfactions of forming your experience into text, into prose, the way it reflects back at you. What are some of the satisfactions of being a writer that you wouldn't have gotten if, say, you'd opened a muffler shop or something?
Clean fingernails. I think that there's so many satisfactions, it's very difficult to pinpoint them. I wrote for years without being published, literally years, and wrote and rewrote and rewrote. I'm very much like Francisco in that regard. I think of myself more as a rewriter than a writer. But I never knew when I got up in the morning, I never had writer's block ever, because I always worked on more than one manuscript at a time. And if I couldn't do one, I'd just do another two. I'd keep moving until I got to one I could do. But I never knew who I was going to meet that morning, what kind of a character would pop into my mind, what kind of situation might evolve from the way the plot was moving. And it's that, to me, it's that constant sense of discovery that you get whether you publish or not that was the most important thing.
Well, since I made the comment, writing is such a wonderful experience for me. It's when I'm in a writing mode, I feel like I'm in my own skin, really. And I've done many things professionally, other things, but the writing is always something that I come back to. And I'm sure if I could, I would do it full time, and perhaps I will in the near future. But it puts you in a different world. It's just in a different reality, if you will. And I know that when I'm writing, I just lose track of time and track of just whatever's going around me, and I don't even feel that I'm hungry, or get up and do anything. It's just you're just there. You're in this different reality, and the process of it is afterwards that you have something. And I do believe in rewriting. I think that that's just part of writing. Is the best is a lot of rewriting, but to the ability to have someone else read it and to impart an idea, or for somebody to get it, to understand what you're trying to do, or to see the image you're projecting, hear it, taste it, experience it with you, and repeat it to you and tell you it's affected me, it's touched me, is really quite extraordinary. I've had experiences where people come and talk to me about passages in my book, and they just start crying. And it becomes quite an extraordinary event. I think actually Francisco witnessed one episode where it just became this big crying fest, But that's the way we are, and then Latinos, we cry because we're happy. We cry because it's just part of our expression. But I think that when you can touch somebody emotionally because it's a memory, or it's something that's validated of an experience, there's something wonderful about that kind of emotional sharing, and I love being part of that.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better, Rose. I get a lot of personal satisfaction from writing. I think of writing as a sculptor. You chip at words, you arrange them, and you play with them till you just get them right. But so that's the personal satisfaction. The other satisfaction I get, as I mentioned earlier, is when readers react to my work in a positive way, or sometimes in a negative way. It depends. But there is a reaction, and I see the power that words have in communicating ideas, and also, as Rose pointed out, the power of words to move hearts and minds, and that to me is really where the biggest reward comes from.
Yeah.
All of you write from your direct experiences, and so my question was, do you feel like when you're writing the stories of your life that the message that you're trying to convey is something totally inherent in just telling those stories, or is it something that you have said ahead of time? You know, what message you're really trying to convey strongly, and you know, is that something ever present that you're looking at? And like you were saying, does that have a lot to do with the rewriting that you do, or?
Well, speaking for myself, I should say that I've been at this for a long, long time, and I'm way past being able to write about my life, because my life's not that interesting. You know, 300 or 400 stories in, you start. So I've cast about, and I write about anything that interests me. And for example, in my new book, there's a short story called Two-Headed Man Hangs Self. One head depressed. That's the title. And that just came from standing in a supermarket line and seeing those crazy tabloids. I thought, what would happen if? And so what if is a very important question. But I have done a lot of things that were personal. And I think when I'm writing personal essays, for example, I try simply to let the shared humanity create the connection. And I don't aim at, I just know that ultimately we all love, we all want to be loved, we all fear, we don't want to be feared very often, and on and on and on. That's what I try to do with that kind of work. But with the more imaginative kinds of things, each story at that point, or each essay, is very distinct. You know, they each have their own little path. But when writing about personal experiences, as I said, I trust the shared humanity to create the connection.
Yeah, I don't try to manipulate the reader rather, in terms of I want you to feel this, and so I'm going to write it in a way that you're going to experience exactly what I want you to. I think that if you tell the story, you will probably come to similar conclusions. Although I think that sometimes when I'm telling a story, whether it be about my own life or other people's lives that I've encountered, other meanings come up, which I hadn't quite thought about. So it's always a little bit of a surprise, and a nice surprise.
I would agree with that. I think you have to write from your heart and be honest with yourself. And I don't try to manipulate the writing to get a particular emotion from the reader. I try to be as honest as possible, the way I experience it, or the way I saw someone else experience. I just simply write the way I see it, and try to be as honest as I can be.
I don't think we have very much more time, but yes, sir.
I have one question. When you are starting to write something, and you, let's say, you're supposed to be a tragedy, and during the writing process, you change your opinion, and that's not tragedy. That's not like positive. Is it possible or not? I mean, the beginning and the end, usually, when you start and when you finish, is it the same, or you can change your using the writing?
Well, speaking for myself, I usually don't know where it's going when I start. One of the most overrated skills that they tried to teach me in English courses was outlining. That just isn't the way I work. I move from a personality or an event or something. And frequently, the last thing I write is the beginning, because only after I finish the story do I know what it's about. So I will then, after having done what I think is the body of the story, then I'll figure out an opening that I think is appropriate for it. So I rarely have that kind of a notion, although I have had, of course. We've all had this experience where you think this is going to tear people's hearts out, and you end up laughing at it yourself. You say, well, this has probably failed as a tragedy, but it might make a good comedy. My statement would be write about the event, write about the personality, write about the passion, but don't assume you know where it's going to end up, because particularly in longer pieces like novels, the characters take on a life of their own. That is, you've endowed them with certain characteristics, and they will not go against those characteristics any more than a human being will. They won't. The right-handed guy is not going to become left-handed halfway through the novel, if you want the novel published anyway. And so you have to let their characteristics begin to take the plot and develop the theme. So I would just think, as I said before, consider it a kind of voyage of discovery. Every piece you write, you're making a new discovery. You're Columbus or someone like that all over again in the world of literature.
I would say what's really important is to be really passionate about what you're writing about, because if you can't, if you don't care about your subject matter or whatever it is, nobody else is going to care either. So it's not so important to me in terms of which way. I don't know which way to go with it in terms of is it a tragedy, not a tragedy? Ultimately, it's whatever is really the material that is really meaningful and strong.
Well, maybe I'll ask one more question that'll be impossible to answer, and then we can call it quits, which is that in many ways, the lives that you've led have been the American dream. That this is coming from poverty. These are the stories of people who, through teachers or libraries or public institutions, have gone beyond the impoverishment of youth and have become successful. And yet what you did with it is not go to become wealthy. What you've used it for is to deliver social messages and something that you feel it's really important that people know. If beyond the writing, if you could sum up in one impossible sentence what it is that's behind your work that you think people really need to know about being not just a writer but a human being, what would you say?
That we're all a human family.
Well, all our stories are universal, and when you read our stories, and the more you see that we're more similar than different, the more understanding you get about the human family.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I'm going to repeat what I said earlier. I think that when we tell our stories, even though we come from different ethnic backgrounds, that we do make human connections. And in terms of what I write, I try to, or at least I hope, that my work promotes social justice, basically, in one.
Well, thank you, and thank you, Doug, for arranging this, and for everybody for coming.